Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we'll venture into the fascinating but also treacherous realm of the counterfactual, the what-ifs of the Second World War. There are endless topics among these might have beens, but today we'll dig into the invasion that never was, Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to invade Britain in 1940. Jesse, good to be back. Here we are for another episode, another week, another episode. This time, as I've just said, counterfactual, a what if. There are so many, but I think this is probably one of the most interesting, perhaps also astonishing ones when you look at the planning on both the German and the British side. And of course, we'll look into it in much more detail. We explore all different angles as always. And as we always do in this particular podcast, we'll bust some myths. And as we also always do, before we really get stuck into it, I think we need to talk a little bit about the context, the strategic situation. Why did we end up with these plans? Why were the Germans planning this invasion? And what were the British thinking about it? So Jesse, talk us through the situation in the summer of 1940 a little bit, and let's start at that. Over to you.
All right, well, we're starting on that slippery slope of the counterfactual, of the what if. It's something we haven't done yet really that much on the podcast, but it's fun. It's fun to think about all these alternate scenarios and then to run them through the mill of a bit of a closer look with a bit of a historical lens. It's always very exciting if in a strategic game you're playing Germany and all of a sudden you're able to land in Britain with a surprise strike in the first couple of rounds. Just to my Axis and Allies fans out there, you know what I'm talking about. And so I think it's worth a look at this kind of topic with a bit more of a sensible historical background. So the situation in the summer of 1940, as I'm sure listeners, you're not going to be surprised, is not particularly rosy for the British. Not only is France been knocked out of the war by June/July, by the time, the papers are signed and so on, but the British don't really have a proper army anymore because the British Expeditionary Force was fighting in France, of course, and then they get caught around Dunkirk. And there's this great dramatic story of the evacuation at Dunkirk, but they're evacuating men. They're not evacuating trucks. They're not evacuating tanks. They're not evacuating armored cars. And so Britain is sitting there more or less alone. Yes, there's the Empire. Yes, there's Canada, Australia, India, and so on, but they're quite far, and the situation is quite dire. And the Germans are on the coast. So from the British point of view, I think if you're considering the idea, all right, well, the enemy is right over there, your principal concern is that you don't have much to fight them if they end up on your soil. So I think that's one of the important starting points that we have as far as the situation in 1940 is concerned. And it's not like the Brits have had much success when they have met up with the Germans, either in France and Belgium or when they were fighting in Norway. And that fighting is also just wrapping up in about June of 1940. The RAF also had significant losses in that continental campaign in France, and they lost quite a bit of strength, which leads us probably into a bit of a discussion about the Battle of Britain and its role in Sea Lion. But I will pass it back to you, Matthias, to fill in any of the gaps here or any points you want to emphasize looking at this situation in the summer of 1940.
I think when you look at it from the British side, it really is absolutely dire. And we tend to forget this because we know what happens afterwards. Of course, because this is counterfactual, we know the invasion didn't happen. We know that in the end, in 1945, Germany, of course, is defeated. But in 1940, it looked really, really different. You look at the map and there is a lot of, if you want to call it red or whatever color you use for the Germans. So the Germans are controlling pretty much all of continental Europe. And you've got this tiny little island sitting there, the UK still holding out, but it's really not looking good. And you talked about Dunkirk, and I'm terribly sorry to say that, particularly to the British listeners, Dunkirk is a massive defeat for the British Army. I know it's being celebrated and heralded as this great whatever on the British side today. However, in 1940, the perception and the view was actually very, very different. And it is difficult. The troops come back, not all of them, but a lot of them come back. This is a beaten army. They don't have, as you've already said, no equipment. They simply don't have any weapons. When you look at the Orbans and the material that these troops actually still have and what is still in the arsenals in the UK, it is not a lot. So sometimes these people simply don't even have rifles. And it's an army that is completely demoralized. We mustn't forget this. So it's really difficult. Very different on the German side. I still remember, and I was just looking at them today, actually, a number of photographs that my grandfather took. He was also at Dunkirk, of course, in a very different uniform, one in field grey. And he went to the beaches of Dunkirk after the fighting was over. And he took photos of all this abandoned material and the vehicles that you already mentioned. And he just wrote on the back of one of these photographs, England kaputt. And I always think, well, if only the world would be very different. Trains would be on time, but there we are. That, of course, didn't happen. But that was the expectation, the view in 1940. Germany really is victorious. If the Germans can defeat the French, which was a very strong army, which had an extremely good reputation because they had fought very well in the First World War, if you can get to the British, if you can get to the UK, probably at least the land forces would not be a match for the German Wehrmacht. But of course, there are other factors that come into play here. You already mentioned them. You mentioned the air forces. We need to talk about the Navy. And that, of course, makes it difficult for the Germans. So when we look at the German plans, I mean, what is it that Germans really want to do? Maybe we need to take it a step back again and look at what Hitler's ideas are, because Hitler, of course, is the driving factor in all of this. He decides the policy. He's also very influential now in pure military terms. So what is it that Hitler actually wants to do? Jesse, can you shed some light on this?
Well, I think, having absorbed most of my impressions from popular history and the British role in World War II through film or memory and commemoration, of course, it feels to the Brits and many of us in the English-speaking world that Britain is, this final line of defense, and that Germany is focused on them as an enemy to defeat them. And this is kind of the culmination of the early part of the war. But I think if you look at it from the German point of view, it's a bit different than that, right? Hitler has a long history with wanting to focus on Eastern Europe, going all the way back to the 1920s, of course, when he writes Mein Kampf, and he says that the final objective, of course, is an empire in the East for the so-called living space. And the fact that Britain and France declared war on him in 1939 when he invaded Poland, it's not like he was opposed to fighting them. It's not like he thought highly of their liberal capitalist democracy, or however you want to spin it. But at the same time, that wasn't his main objective. And he wasn't looking for a war with Britain and France at that particular moment. He even held some admiration for the British Empire and had some ideas about possibly, coexisting with the British Empire and a German Empire in Eastern Europe. So when Britain is still there, France is defeated, it's not like there was a long-term plan for what to do with Britain. So I think the Germans come into this situation in the summer of 1940 with a little bit of strategic and planning improvisation, just based on the grand strategy, just based on the really big, long picture where Hitler wasn't dreaming and fantasizing about making landing craft to do amphibious landings in Britain in this final clash with Britain. No, he was fantasizing about tanks headed through the steppe in the East. And I think that plays a role then in the plans that we're going to get to.
And when you read Mein Kampf, you mentioned it, the utterly dull and boring book that it is. Very difficult to get your hands on in Germany because it's still not allowed to have it. As a historian, it's a bit easier. Of course, I've read it a number of times. It is dull, it is dire, it is really, really boring. We mustn't forget that this is already the very heavily edited version by a chap called Putzi Handstengel. He was one of the more intellectual ones of the early Nazi movement, so he edits it, and it's still quite dire. So just think what the first draft must have looked like. And when you look at Mein Kampf, it's all there, as you've already said. And I think we need to look at two different aspects here. The first one is the pure political one. So Hitler, very, very clear in what he says. He says, of course, he wants the living space in the East. That's what Germany needs, according to him, consequence of the First World War. But then he also talks about the other empires. You've already mentioned it. He's got no desire to destroy the British Empire. He admires the British Empire. How can such a small country control a quarter of the globe? So a lot of admiration for the British. And then, of course, because he's got this alliance with Italy, that's the third large empire in Europe. And at least from the German point of view, there are actually no frictions or tensions with the British because the Germans are in the East, the British have their empire. So where would these two clash? They wouldn't. That's the one thing. And the second thing, of course, is the racial aspect that you find. Of course, in Hitler's ideas and ideology, that's always very important. And of course, to him, the Brits, particularly the English, are, of course, Anglo-Saxons. That means, well, basically, they are Germans. So he doesn't really see the need to fight against them. Yes, of course, you have a bit of influx of the Normans. There's a bit of French blood, but that's only a small percentage. So he says, actually, when you look at them, the racial aspect, ideology, all these things, they should be fighting with us. And there is the story that when France and Britain declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, Hitler actually has a nervous breakdown. He doesn't want this war. He doesn't want to fight the British, and suddenly he's got it. And it's really interesting when you look at the early years of World War II. So he goes into Poland because that's German territories. It's in the way to the east. Between 1939 and then 1941, when the Germans finally invade the Soviet Union, everything for Hitler is, perhaps you might call it a detour. He doesn't want to fight these nations, but he has to. That's how he sees it, because they declared war on Germany. Which, of course, internally for Germany is, in inverted commas, quite good, because from a propaganda point of view, he can now turn around and say, look at this, they want to refight the First World War. We don't have any problems with them, but it's the evil Western powers. So from a propaganda point of view, very good, but in terms of realpolitik, an absolute disaster. And of course, another thing we mustn't forget is when we look at these two different nations, Germany is a landlocked country. To the Germans, the only thing that really matters, even today, is the army. So even in military terminology, even today, the term for army, Heer, is quite often used simultaneously for all the services. It's also very confusing when you start talking about ranks, for example. In the German-speaking world, a soldier is basically everybody from all the services. Where, of course, in the English-speaking world, a soldier is only from the land forces, from the army. But then you've got sailors and you've got airmen and all these. So sometimes you can see there's a bit of confusion. But the reason for that is that the army is so very, very important. In the British case, of course, that's not necessarily the case. So the first line of defense used to be the Navy. It's perhaps also the Air Force. The Army always comes third, well, probably third. And that also plays out here, and it's something that we need to look at. So, for example, when we look, again, go back to 1939, and we look at the outbreak of the war, Raeder, who is the head of the German Navy, he also has a bit of a nervous breakdown. So lots of nervous breakdowns going on in the German hierarchy at that particular time.
War is a stressful business.
There we go. A bit of a theme developing here. And he says the only thing that we can do as the German Navy, fighting against the Royal Navy, is now to die with honor. That's the term that he uses in September 1939. So they're very, very clear that the German Navy is no match for the Royal Navy at all. And of course, that then gets even worse because you then have the operation in Scandinavia, particularly up in Norway, where a large proportion of the German fleet is actually sunk by the Royal Navy. So when they go into the planning, as we'll do in a minute, and explore the German plans for 1940 in a bit more detail, the German Navy knows very, very well that they can't stand up to the Royal Navy. So all sorts of issues. The army might be very victorious. They might see themselves as the best army in the world, lots of medals being handed out, lots of people getting promoted. But actually, there are other factors that come into play here and that make it very, very difficult, well, actually impossible, for the Germans to cross the Channel, these few kilometers of water between the UK and France.
Yeah, I was going to point out the surface fleet losses that the Germans took as well in Norway and in the North Sea, because they were quite crippling for what they might have wanted to do with the surface fleet after that, including anything related to sea line. So, shall we start with the defenders? Shall we start with the British very briefly and talk about what they were thinking of doing with the limited resources they have? Or do we want to do it the other way and go with the active side rather than the reactive side? Take your pick.
Let's start with
Roll
the
the
British.
dice. All right,
Let's
we're going to
start with the
We're going to
British.
go with the British. In that case, let's think about this. If you are sitting in London, yeah, you're nervous. You don't care that Hitler wrote 15 years earlier that he was more interested in Eastern Europe than in you, because you know that the cupboard is bare, as you mentioned, Matthias. It's so bare. I looked up a few statistics just to sort of drive this home here. In June 1940, so after the Dunkirk disaster and all the heavy equipment is left abandoned or destroyed on the continent, the UK Home Forces have 16 divisions, 15 infantry, one armored division in the UK at the time. All these formations are under strength. Now, in the months after that, July, August, September, this period that we're talking about where a sea lion might have come into play, especially August, September, there are some reinforcements that arrive, some more evacuated troops from other places, from Norway, for example. And then there are some Commonwealth reinforcements that arrive, including Canadians. But you cannot make up that shortage of equipment, heavy weapons, anti-tank weapons in particular is a big problem, but even small arms, as you mentioned, even down to rifles. You can't make that up in a question of a few weeks. What the British try to do is build some defenses. So they're pretty rushed, though. Obviously, it's not like this is a well thought out, long planned, balanced. No, they're building chains of pillboxes. They're building little mortar emplacements. They're fortifying some individual houses. They have a notion of a couple of different lines of defense. One is a so-called coastal crust line on the coast, and then one farther inland for a worse outcome, or if there's a successful German landing, called the General Headquarters Line as well. They try to raise local defense militias of volunteers. About 250,000 sign up in the first week, but they've only got 70,000 rifles to try to equip them. So that's why you have guys marching around. Now, I think I've seen actual historical pictures of this. I'm speaking from memory. Maybe it's just a scene in Dad's Army somehow that's getting mixed up in my brain, but I feel like they're marching around with, broomstick style fake wooden rifles just to drill. I mean, things are pretty bad. I mean, I've even read there's a pamphlet, because they're trying to keep up morale also, right? So they put out this pamphlet for citizens that that suggests, it says don't help the paratroopers. Airborne operations, another one we're going to get into when we get into the German planning and so on. It says don't help them and so on. You can use pepper to blind them in your home. I mean, if that's an official government publication, you are scraping the bottom of the pepper barrel for your defensive plans. So these are the kinds of things the British are doing. I don't mean to make light of it. Of course, they have good quality units and they're quite serious about trying to defend themselves. But there's such a crying lack of weapons and time to plan that you end up with these very sort of sad examples of what they're trying to do, essentially. Am I being too harsh on my British Commonwealth cousins, Matthias?
No, I'm shaking my head here. I think you're absolutely right. It's fascinating. I had one PhD student who wrote his PhD on exactly this topic. How prepared were the UK land forces to face a German invasion? And it is actually quite shocking. So the results that you can see in this PhD, and also, of course, in other writings, and you mentioned Dad's Army and other things, it is really, really dire. So there's really nothing left. There is enthusiasm because the people join, they want to do something, they join the other Home Guard, but because they don't have any weapons, they can't get proper training, it makes it really, really difficult. And morale very quickly hits rock bottom in the UK as well. There are weekly statistics and reports put together that are presented to the Prime Minister. And when you look at them, you can see that morale is not particularly high at that point, because everybody can see that nothing is left. And even what is left, which isn't an awful lot, is used in such a way that it's not very, very efficient, because the British don't even know where the Germans are coming from and where they want to land. And as always, you end up with a compromise solution. And that, of course, means it's a bad solution. So when you look at the dislocation of the forces, where they're placed, what they're supposed to do, it makes it really difficult. So, for example, the British have one mobile reserve. It's basically one division, but because they can't really decide where to place them, they put them out somewhere in the Salisbury Plains. So if you're not familiar where that is, it's in the title, Salisbury, the city of Salisbury, which even today is a very, very big training area for the British Army. And that is about, I'm not quite sure, let's say 150 kilometers to the southwest of London. So it's out there on the western flank, so to speak, even though the British think that the Germans are going to take further to the east. So why leave that reserve there? So you can see there are all sorts of half-baked compromise solutions, and that makes it really difficult. You also have very different levels of training in the units and formations in the British Army. So there's all this idea about combined arms warfare. And in theory, the British are really good at this. So when the British Army goes to France in 1940, it's probably the most motorized army of the entire war. It's really well equipped compared to all the other armies. But they lose their vehicles, and also in good British style and tradition, every formation is doing things differently. So you don't have a uniform approach, which makes the conduct of a big defensive battle really, really difficult. And that's waters down to the Home Guard, for example, as well. And there are numerous accounts where these guys, in inverted commas, just get bored, and they're told to guard some, I don't know, crossroads or something. Well, you know what? Nothing's happening here. So they just go home. Because, well, it's probably common sense. Well, the Germans aren't coming, even if they were coming. What can we do here? So, well, you know what? Let's just go home. So you can see all sorts of underlying problems and underlying issues that you find here on the British side. So it's really, really difficult. On top of that, of course, quite close to the landing beaches, you've got London, the capital. Not only the capital itself, but millions of people. At that time, if I'm not mistaken, the largest or second largest city in the world. It's big by 1940 standards. How are you going to protect this? How are you going to protect the civilian population? You can't evacuate them all. So that, of course, gives the British also headache. And there is a lot of thinking going on in the British circuits. How can we do this? You talked about the defensive lines. I live to the south of London. And when I drive around, I can still see all these bunkers and these pillboxes, normally at crossroads. And you look at them, and you can see that's actually quite a sad affair. Yes, they try to do their very best, but what you normally find is one quickly established dugout, pillbox, bunker, whatever you want to call it, at this crossroad, and that's it. There is no second one. There is no interlocking locks of fire. There is no support. And you look at this and you think, how do you think you're going to achieve anything with this? So it's quite sad, really. But that's all they could do. They're trying to use the terrain. You mentioned this when you look at the defensive lines. So they run along canals, for example, or heights that you find here. But it's really, in many ways, it's the poor man's solution, because there is nothing else they can do.
Yeah, and I think part of the poor man's solution comes in another aspect of the British expectation of what might happen, or plan for a sort of worst case scenario, is that they plan on guerrilla operations behind German lines. So they are expecting that it's quite possible that there will be a fighting line somewhere inland, and that these guerrilla units, which never really got to an advanced stage of training and organization and so on, but there were thoughts in this direction to harass German logistics, as the Soviet partisans, of course, would do successfully several years later in a much different scenario and a much different place. The British also evacuate children to Canada, for example. They evacuate their gold reserve to Canada. So there are some steps that show the depth of the fear that these defensive plans may not work if the Germans ever get to make a significant landing on the British coast. But that's not easy. So if we sort of put the shoe on the other foot now, and we've talked a lot about how hard the British have it in preparing for an invasion. Well, even if you are the victorious Germans and you've just whipped France, one of the great powers, you've got all sorts of troops, you've hardly taken any casualties, you haven't really lost that much equipment. I mean, you've lost some, but of course, you can repair anything that's broken, you can recover it, you can seize French equipment, and so on. In a way, from the German point of view, you're in a great position. The trouble is the water. And that is the biggest, I think that's the biggest element that makes this a counterfactual, right? This is the biggest element as to why it didn't happen. The French often in YouTube comments and, Twitter debates and things, which are not always very level-headed, and by that I mean almost never, the French very often will say, hey, yeah, we lost, but you British, if it weren't for the channel, you would have lost too. And I think there is something to that. Of course, the German plan A was not to have to fight in Britain at all. And Hitler still hopes in the earlier part of the summer that the British will see reason, accept that they cannot win, and surrender. So plan A is actually just diplomatic. Let's put it that way. But it's very obvious that plan A is not going to work with the government that the British have and the public support that government has. So Hitler starts some more serious planning. And Matthias, you're the perfect guy to walk us through a little bit more of the details of the planning that is undertaken, actually, even from 1939.
Absolutely right. It starts very early. It actually starts before the outbreak of World War II, because the beginning of August 1939, so about 1 month before the UK declares war on Germany, the Germans put together a study, which is a study on the air war against England, as they would have called it. Don't forget that for the Germans, the whole of the UK and Great Britain, that's always England. So Great Britain doesn't exist. Everyone calls everyone an Englishman. It's a bit like every German being called Bavarian, which really winds me up because I don't own lederhosen. I'm from the north of Germany. So it's a little bit like, oh, you're English, where's your kilt? So that's basically, it's the equivalent. That's my little rant over. There we are.
We've just lost a third of the listenership right there. It's over.
That's the way it is. So they put this together and they say, well, if we need to fight an air war, so it's an Air Force study, they say, well, there might be the need to actually invade Britain. Which you might say is a bit strange because why is an air war and suddenly they talk about invasion? But this is the first time that this get mentioned. And then later on, after Poland has been defeated in November 1939, so on the 15th of November, Reda, who is the head of the Navy, issues a study in which they look at a possible invasion of Britain. And of course, let's not forget at that stage, the strategic situation is very different because France hasn't been defeated yet. So they think, well, if we want to get there, we would have to go there from the ports in Germany, cross the North Sea and land somewhere. And very quickly, of course, they realize, you know what, we can't do that. Because there is the Royal Navy, we can't give air support to the ships as they go across. It's too far. So it simply doesn't work. And then you might say that they kind of put this on the back burner. The army also looks at this in early December 1939. And on the 13th of December, the army presents a study. And I think this is what we could do. Again, hampered by the fact that France hasn't been defeated yet. So where could they land? It's somewhere in East Anglia, so to the east of London. Very quickly, as you realize, you know what, this is not really going to work. But you can already see one of the issues here, which is really a problem on the German side. The Germans are very, very bad at joint warfare at that particular time. So here you've got, first of all, an Air Force study. You then have a naval study, and then you've got an army study. And they're all doing their own things. They don't even talk to each other. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier. So the army is the important thing. Everything else is just there to support. And everyone, in inverted commas, looks down a little bit on the Navy and down on the Air Force because, well, what can they do? And the Air Force was actually designed to support the army. So they're all planning in, you might say, in a vacuum without looking left or right. And that is a big, big problem, which is going to come back to haunt them. And then, of course, the situation changes. As we've already explained, France is defeated. And when you look at the peace treaty that they signed, it actually says that Germany is occupying territories in the northern France in order to continue the war against Britain. That's the official reason. And when you look at what happens in 1940, you've got the southern part of France is technically, nominally independent. In reality, it isn't. It's a puppet regime that's installed, but in theory, it's an independent country, an independent state. And the Germans say, no, we just need this bit here because we need to continue the war against Britain. That's why we're occupying this. Hitler then gives a speech in the Reichstag in which he offers peace to the UK. That, of course, doesn't get anywhere. There's also talk of secret channels that they use, trying to make some sort of peace with the British, but basically the British make that public, and that's the end of that particular story. And Hitler then realizes that, you know what, there's nothing we can do here, so probably there's going to be some sort of military confrontation. And that leads then to the Weisung, so the order, the Operation Order number 16, issued by Hitler on the 16th of July 1940, which says the German military now has to prepare for a landing in the UK. And that's interesting, if such a landing is really necessary. So that's in the opening statement of this particular order. So again, just from this half sentence, you can see that Hitler wasn't all that keen. And that's actually shared by the military. They are not very keen because, first of all, they don't want to fight there. They also realize in all their different little areas that it's very difficult to achieve this. The Navy knows, as we already said, they simply can't secure the channel for the German ships and the German barges to go across. So that's written out. That means it all falls onto the Air Force. And Göring, as the head of the Air Force since 1939, has said, you know what, that's not achievable. So the first plan that came out in 1939 by the Air Force, he writes a one-page memorandum to sign, basically just says, you know, this is completely stupid. We're not going to do this. We can't win this. So there are some of the underlying issues that you find here already within the German system as well. And when we look briefly at what the army is actually planning, what is it that they want to do? Again, you can see they don't really have an understanding of how an operation of this scale and this difficulty should be conducted, should be planned. Because when you look at this, the army comes up with a broad front. Because that makes sense to them, because that makes it difficult for the enemy to know what the point of main effort is, to outmaneuver the enemy, to throw the Germans back into the sea. So they basically, in their first plan, want to land from Ramsgate, which is to the east of London, all the way to Lyme Regis, which is in Dorset. So more or less the entire southern coast of England was supposed to get invaded by the Germans. In order to do that, they have three armies. I'm going from north to south now. So the northern one, that's the strongest one, under Army Group A. This is the 16th Army. And the first wave, they were supposed to land 6 divisions. And these would have come from Ostende, for example, and Calais and Boulogne. So that's the short route. That's the short bit towards the UK, Calais, Dover, where it's really, really quite narrow. So that's the point of an effort for the Germans. At the same time, they want to send about 4 divisions in the first wave from Le Havre, which is quite a long way away. Think Normandy, think D-Day. This is what you're thinking. This is the terrain. And then further to the west, from Cherbourg, they also want to land another 3 divisions in this Lyme Regis area of Dorset. So this is really completely barking mad. It makes sense from a pure military point of view, or an army point of view, let's say. But the moment they present this plan to Hitler, and this is the first time that the Air Force and the Navy hear of that, they say, you know what, this is absolutely ludicrous. We can't do that. And the Navy then presents its own plan and says, no, this can't happen. So we're going to have a small landing area. And I can see that Jesse is moving in his seat and he wants to interject and correct me. I hand over to you.
Correction. No, perish the thought. But I just wanted to jump in on this topic of the Army's plan.
Yeah.
Because the degree of divorced from reality is really dramatic. I mean, you mentioned it, but there's this one communique from the Army High Command that's in one of these sort of planning, what's the word I'm looking for, brainstorming documents or early planning, assessment, what have you. And it says this, I'm going to quote just 2 lines from it. It is assumed that the battle is conducted in the manner of an attack across a river, but that no fire protection can be provided from the jumping off shore. I mean, if you think, if your frame of reference for attacking across the English Channel is crossing a river but without direct fire support from the opposite bank, as the Germans would say, you're in the wrong movie.
Yeah.
You do not know what's going on. You do not have an understanding for what this operation requires, what it is, and what is essentially impossible. I think the initial army suggestion or request was something along the in the order of 40 divisions being a part of this operation. I mean, now we're talking something larger than Normandy, with a fraction of the resources, of course. And part of that has to do with shipping shortages. But I'm sure when we get into the Navy side of thing, you'll talk about the prospect of towing canal barges across the English Channel to the tune of 40 divisions and all their supplies for an ongoing campaign.
It is just absolutely barking mad, and a very, very good quote here. They're absolutely right. It's interesting because when you look at then the Navy reaction again, and the first time they see this document, you can imagine how they're pulling their hair out, and you can imagine the big, let's call it a debate that they're having, or a shouting match. And the army planning, again, is completely illusionary. So looking at the numbers, so to begin with, in the first wave, they said it's 13 infantry divisions. So you set infantry divisions in first because they need to secure the bridgehead. That kind of makes sense. You would then have these barges, and we'll return to the naval equipment in a minute. These would have to then go back to the French side, and they're factored in a loss rate of 10%. I mean, that is quite ambitious and very optimistic, if you think about it. And then you would have the second wave, and these were mainly motorized infantry and panzer divisions, 8 of them in total, so to exploit and to break out from the bridgehead. And then you had reinforcements coming in the last wave, and that was supposed to be another further 6 infantry divisions. So this is substantial, this is big, and yes, the equipment that they're using is absolutely ludicrous. What's also interesting when you look at a small little aspect there is the use of paratroopers that were supposed to get used, and also in particular the German special forces, the Brandenburger. So Brandenburger, they're called the Brandenburger because there is a town called Brandenburg to the west of Berlin, and this is where they had their headquarters. And starts as a very small special forces unit. Towards the end of the war, it's then formed into basically box standard motorized infantry division. But at this stage, they're still, the funny lot, you might say, proper special forces. They got people in who were fluent in English, who'd spent a lot of their time in the US or in the UK or wherever, absolutely fluent in English, knew the culture, so they could be thrown in there as the fifth column. And that is really interesting. So it's a sub-story, but they made quite a bit of it, the Germans. So, for example, these Paris and the Brandenburger were also largely supposed to fly in and jump into Britain via parachute. They, for example, had the task of securing the port of Dover. Because the Germans knew that's going to be very important. There is a big military fortress there. You've got a big castle. So let's use these guys to do it. So you've got this. So they're trying to think outside the box a little bit. But again, when you just look at the sheer numbers they're looking at and what is available, particularly at the naval side, it's absolutely ludicrous. And again, this is the big problem that the Germans have basically from 1939 all the way up to 1945. They simply don't think in a joined-up way. The Germans come up with a joint doctrine, which they write in 1938. But actually, while it's still in draft status, they basically just ditch it and that's it. And they forget about it. And yes, the army does everything. They do their own planning. They do a river crossing and a post-river crossing. That's what they think they're doing. Whereas all the others say, you know what, this really doesn't work that way. It's just complete nonsense what you're trying to achieve here. And that's very, very obvious and clear from the Navy planning. For example, there's a very good map. You can see it in the archives in Freiburg, in the military archives. It's the Navy map. And they've actually drawn the lines of where the German ships would go. And someone, because he probably had a spare minute, he drew a little ship there. And he just wrote beneath it, well, gegen England, so against England, which is a very famous German military song from the First World War, also very famous in World War II. And then he draws all sorts of funny little men next to it or what have you. So he obviously had lots of time because he knew, you know what, the whole planning is completely bonkers. It ain't going to happen. So let's have some fun here. That's what he thought.
Yeah, this was another element of the planning. I mean, it's one thing for Hitler to order the military to plan something. But then if nobody really believes it's got a chance, you're also not going to put as much effort into that planning. The plan that comes out of that's not going to be as good. There's a bit of a sort of morale and institutional inertia, resistance, or what have you, that starts to come into play as well. So when the Navy puts in this counter proposal, it says we need a narrower frontage. That's all we can manage. They make some suggestions like, well, we're gonna try to hold off the Royal Navy from the landing areas by using sea mines. So having these areas that are mined, that'll keep the Royal Navy sort of off our backs for long enough for us to drag these barges that we've requisitioned in continental Europe across and get more men across. Now, that doesn't seem to have a lot of long-term potential, given the Royal Navy resources. But nonetheless, we'll assess the doability of this a little more coherently in a couple of minutes. But when the Navy is sort of saying we need to cut down the plan here, the Army plan, and land on a narrower front or series of fronts or whatever, this is then anathema to the Army. Because essentially, from the Army's point of view, you are dooming them on the beachheads, because you're making sure that if you only land in a narrow spot, that the defender is going to be able to concentrate his resources on land defense against that smaller beachhead. You're not going to be able to keep him guessing with the wider front as to where the point of main effort is going to be. The infamous Schwerpunkt, as the Germans say, the point of main effort.
Good German word.
And all German words are good.
Absolutely. They always work. They always work.
I've spent years learning this stuff. I can't say a bad word about the language now. The sunk cost fallacy. I'm too deep into it. Anyway, General Halder is livid when he sees the Navy's counter-proposal for a much, much narrower front. He says something along the lines of, you're asking me to put my army to march it straight into the sausage machine. I mean, there could not be a more German analogy.
That's very German as well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can see a total disconnect between the resources required, the resources they have, the political side that's giving this order, and then the inter-service problems. So it's quite serious. But I think they make another assumption that isn't quite realistic, because they expect that when they have a successful landing and threaten London, that will force the British to negotiate. As threatening Paris and basically capturing northern France and Paris forced the French to negotiate. And that's not a safe assumption to make in World War II. For example, the Soviets probably could have lost Moscow and likely would not have been forced to negotiate if their state and government had survived that experience. You would have thought that the Soviets would be forced to negotiate long before that, even given the losses that they took. So I think, you have to have a political objective in mind that you can achieve when you're using military means to achieve that political end, right? This is the famous saying that war is politics by other means from Clausewitz. You have to have some kind of political outcome that you want. And they don't really assess, I think, the British will to fight on very successfully. So even if they had been able to invade, the plan has another flaw, in this way, a bit of a political flaw. And I think that's a bit of a stone that's sometimes left unturned when assessing the plans for the operation.
Mm-hmm. And that comes back to the opening sentence of the Führer Directive number 16. So invade if it is really necessary. So you can see they don't really want to do this. They think that a show of force would be enough to change the situation. And that comes out in all the documents and all the planning all the time. And you can see it also being played out again in the final solution that they have to the problem of these different plans. Because, again, a little bit like on the British side, a compromise solution, you also get a compromise solution here, which really doesn't do anything for anybody, because Hitler then directs, and again, both the Navy and the Army are completely livid when Hitler decides this, that they're going to keep the original deployment, so the main thrust coming in from the area of Ostende to Boulogne, so in the Pas-de-Calais area, where the channel is very narrow. Then you've got another pincer coming in from Le Havre. And then you've still got the 6th Army. The original wave were supposed to be 3 divisions. And these are now sitting there as a reserve force. What for? It doesn't make any sense to keep the reserve force over there, but they still keep them there. I don't really know why. And it's embodiment of the problems on the German side. It's also an embodiment of the German army plan again. As you already said, what are you going to do with London? How are you going to do this? So the original German army plan was that the main force coming in the Pas-de-Calais area would actually bypass London pretty much on the east side, whereas the other force coming from Le Havre, landing at Brighton, Portsmouth in this area, would advance, roughly speaking, towards Oxford, St. Albans, bypassing London in the west. So they didn't want to seize London at that particular time because they knew it's a big city, fighting a way through takes too long, takes a lot of casualties. But just, again, the show of force, the sheer military pressure that you put on London by being surrounded would be enough. And what's also interesting, when you look at the final stage of the German plan, so they only plan phase 1, as far as they plan at all for this operation. And that is once they say we've reached a line from Malden in the east to basically Gloucester. So that's about 30, 40 kilometers, perhaps 50 kilometers north of London. That's the first line. That's the first objective. And after that, they don't really plan. So there are no military plans because they're hoping that by this stage, it will be over. And if it's not over, then they have to come up with another plan and then fight their way through, muddle their way through, come to some sort of victory, and they don't even know how to achieve this. So because they don't really know, are we going for the population centers? Are we going for the industrial hubs? Similar debate you can then find later on in the East in 1941 in the Soviet Union. But it's all not really thought through what they really want to go for. It's quite astonishing, actually.
I mean, that German tradition of not really thinking your plans through goes way back, because it reminded me immediately when you were saying it, when you were formulating it that way, of 1918. Of course, there's this final offensive. Oh yeah, we're going to slice through them with our stormtroopers, and then it'll work itself out. And then things will fall into place. And so it's interesting to see that pattern of thinking. We destroy the enemy forces as much as we can, and we throw them back, and then the stuff we want to happen will happen after that. But of course, there are a lot of factors working against the Germans, and I want to throw our counterfactual question, that is a mouthful, counterfactual question out for us here, but I want to throw a wrinkle in it to make it a little bit more interesting, because I think it's probably fair to say, dear listeners, you probably have gotten the idea by now that neither Matthias nor I think that this plan was particularly realistic. But what if the UK had lost the Battle of Britain and the Luftwaffe had air superiority over the Channel? Could the operation have taken place then? I mean, I'm trying to change up some variables here so we can look at things from a bit of a different angle. I'll start off so I can give you a second to gather your thoughts on that, Matthias. But when I thought about this, and well, let's throw in that angle about what if the Luftwaffe had superiority over the Channel, I think of a few other factors here that still, to be honest, work against the Germans. For one thing, you still have the problem that you don't have the shipping tonnage to get the men, supplies, equipment, vehicles, and so on across. So the Germans want to transport their invasion force in something like 2,000 barges, which are not made for purpose, which are not sort of seaworthy. They're made for going up and down canals and rivers. If you think about Normandy in 1944, what it takes from the Allies to establish that successful beachhead, to get the troops ashore in an orderly fashion, and they have total air supremacy and total naval supremacy, which the Germans are not going to have on the naval side, at least. They use 4,000 specialized, purpose-built landing craft for the invasion force. And here we have the Germans operating with half of that, and they're not built for purpose. So they're ad hoc barge vessels, if you want to call it that. So that alone, to me, I don't know. I just don't see a path. I don't see a counterfactual path for the Germans based on the naval situation alone? I don't know. What do you think, Matthias? Now you've had a couple of moments here to gather up your ammo.
I think what you say is absolutely correct. So the weak spot on the German side really is the Navy, but is the wet part, is the stretch of water between France and the UK. You mentioned the numbers, you mentioned the figures, absolutely right. You probably have seen pictures, Jesse, and also the listeners, of these barges being assembled somewhere in Belgium and in northern France, and it just looks like, because they are, as you said, canal barges, that's all they are. There's nothing more. They are not seaworthy. So particularly if you have to fight a slightly longer war and the weather gets bad, you're simply not in a position to sustain the troops on the other side. On top of that, of course, again, if you bring in the 1944 example to compare and contrast, you would be fighting in a very, very hostile territory. Whereas the Allies, when they land in France, well, at least the French were supporting, or at least they were slightly ambivalent when it came to the fighting, but they weren't actively fighting the invading force. So that, again, makes it much more difficult. And the Germans know, of course, that the Navy is the weak spot. And this is why they say it's about the air war. This is where they think they can win. Because once you've got air supremacy over the Channel, you would then be able to defeat the Royal Navy, at least. That's the idea. Let's not talk too much about the Battle of Britain, because I think that's probably another episode. But it is important, and they realize this. And when you go back to the very early ideas that they had in 1939, when Goering, as head of the Air Force, actually says, you know what, this is completely illusionary. We can't achieve this. So the situation, yes, has changed to a degree by 1940, because the airfields are much closer to Britain, because you're now in France. But still, you have a heck of a challenge. Combine that with the Navy that on the German side is practically non-existent, because the few ships that they had, 33 destroyers they had, that was all they had when the war broke out. A third of them sink in Norway. So there are actually ideas on the Navy side. And they say, well, if you really want to land here, we need to wait another year, because if we wait till 1941, both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, the big battleships, will be ready. And they might change the whole game a little bit. But they realize it is really, really difficult. So on the land side, I think once they've landed, and if they had all the equipment and had a steady flow of supplies, then yes, the pure land war, I think the Germans could have won. What that means is the next question. What does winning actually mean? I wrote a book about it. What is winning in war? There's very, very big debates. Is it just defeating the enemy? Is it destroying the enemy armies? Which is very much the German way of thinking at that time. The army only thinks about destroying the other military force. They don't really think too much about occupation and all these things. That's not their task. But that, of course, plays a role. And do you want to occupy Britain then? Do you not want to occupy Britain? Do you just want to have a regime change, for example? Bring a slightly more pro-German government, because there were some tendencies in some parts of the British population and higher society that were a bit more German-leaning. Think about Rudolf Hess flying to the UK in 1941. So it's all part of this relatively big story. Here's another story for us, another podcast.
Oh, there was Lord Halifax as well, of course.
Absolutely,
amenable to a deal with Germany. But go on.
Exactly, yeah. So do that, and then you change the regime, then you withdraw. What are you going to do there? That wasn't really thought through, because no one had expected that this would really happen. So a pure military land victory, if you can land, if you can sustain your troops, okay, that's doable. But these are a lot of big ifs, and everybody knew, particularly on the German side, that it ain't going to work. And actually, also the British were kind of expecting this, because when you have the high time of the invasion scares, and they say, well, the Germans are coming, they're coming tomorrow or next week. Churchill actually sends a number of the very, very valuable Matilda tanks, and they don't have many at that particular time. He sends them to North Africa, because he says, you know what? They're probably not going to come, because, it's so unlikely, because we are still in command of the sea and the air. So how are they going to get across? So a much more, you might say, factual assessment on Churchill's side. Perhaps you might say the Germans also thought that. That's why they're already planning it half-heartedly. But the fact that they were already still planning it, of course, imposed by Hitler, who also didn't really believe in it. But you can see the issues and the problems here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you to drill down just on one aspect. Before I do that, I want to chuck in a couple of other variables that I feel play a role as well, and we haven't gotten into that much. One is about the tides and how difficult they are in the Channel. So that's, there are only, in that August, September time of year, the tides are not, they change quickly. I'm not a maritime expert here, but given what I've read, they change quickly, and there's only a limited number of days where you're going to be able to have the sort of perfect meteorological and tidal conditions that you're going to be able to do this, which makes the whole operation a lot more iffy, a lot more risky, especially when you're trying to do it on a fantasy shoestring type of scenario like the Germans are. And then, of course, there are other less sexy, not battleship related capabilities that the Royal Navy has that would play a big role. They've got tons of minesweepers.
Yeah.
So there's no guarantee that if the Germans mine all the waterways or mine the parts of the channel to prevent Royal Navy access to their communications across to the landing areas, there's no guarantee that that's going to hold, right? That's a way you can, in theory, compensate for your naval inferiority if you're the Germans. But in practice, the Royal Navy's got X number of minesweepers that they can protect with X number of warships, and they're going to be able to get in probably to your lines of communications across the channel. But what I wanted to ask you, Matthias, at this stage was to tell us a little bit more about how you see the battle playing out between the Luftwaffe on the one hand and the Royal Navy on the other, if the Germans were able to get the advantage in the air over the channel. Like, why did you mention just a couple minutes ago that you felt the Luftwaffe would not have really been able to cripple the Royal Navy? Because we do see air power crippling sea power in the Second World War, right? You have the British send these two giant warships. I think the Repulse and King George V, if I remember right, in 1941, they send them to the Pacific. No problem. Japanese just sink them.
Yeah.
Right? That's how the British sink the Bismarck, by air power and so on. So what's different here in 1940, or what's different about the Luftwaffe that makes you sort of come down on the side of, it wouldn't have been likely that they could have taken the Royal Navy out?
Well, I think it's more the assessment at that particular time. When you go back to what Goering said, so this is, of course, before the Second World War really breaks out. This is before you had all the sinking of the ships that you just mentioned, the Yamato and all the other ones. So the Second World War really sees the winning of the Air Force over the Navy. I mean, that's why we have aircraft carriers left, right, and center these days. So, but they, in 1939 in particular, also early 1940, the German side, they didn't really kind of know this, and they hadn't really experienced this. So I think this is more a factor. So it's in their own assessment. I think if the Royal Air Force had been defeated, there would have been a chance for the Germans to use their dive bombers, their Stukas, to sink the British fleet as it sails down from, for example, Scapa Flow. I think that would have been quite achievable, but it was not really in their thinking at that particular time. They weren't convinced, they didn't know, they hadn't seen it, that this was actually possible. So people still believed that the big battleships would rule the day. This is why even the Germans built them before the outbreak of the war, into the war, when you can think, well, what are you using these for? What are they used for? Shouldn't you be investing in something else? So I think it's more perception than anything else on that particular side. It's also interesting because you talked about tides and tidal waves and all these things. It's interesting to compare this again to 1944 very briefly, when, of course, the Allies landed at low tide because the Germans had really defended the beaches. They put all these mines there. So the Allies said, well, we have to land at low tide, otherwise these mines are going to blow up all the landing craft. The Germans, on the other hand, had they gone ahead with their plan and landed in the UK, they would have arrived at high tide, which of course shortens the death strip of the killing zone of the beach. So they can see that even the Germans knew that the British defenses were not as well established. There are all sorts of great ideas. You can see on YouTube, for example, there are official propaganda videos, British ones, where they set the entire sea ablaze, and because they put oil there and then set fire to it. So yeah, they had this, but on the whole, I think the landing, if the Germans had air superiority, which gives them superiority of the sea, that might have succeeded. But then you run into all the other subsequent issues that we already talked about.
Yeah, that list of issues is exceedingly long. One other small bullet point on that long list is that, of course, the Luftwaffe, while they have lots of effective in 1940 dive bombers, they don't have a ton of torpedo bombers. And that's probably one of your best weapons if you're going to be trying to take out ships.
So everything we've just talked about, all the difficulties and the problems, and could the Germans have won or not have won, of course, big what if, because it never happened. How can you find out whether this what if would have turned into something positive or negative for the Germans or the British? Well, the best way to do it, even though it's not 100% accurate, but the best way to do it, and this is what armies still do today. And I can see I'm using the same thing again. I talked about armies earlier. I should say the military. I'm thinking very German here. Say the military still do today. And this is war games. So you war game these things. And in 1974, so a long time after the war, there's a relatively famous war game that is being held in Camberley at the British Army Staff College. This is where I now have my office. This is where I work on a day-to-day basis. And they brought in a number of people that actually had responsibility during the Second World War. So, for example, they bring in Adolf Galland, the famous German fighter pilot, and they play through the invasion of Britain. And the outcome is really interesting because it kind of links in with what we've been saying. So their assessment was that the Germans would have been able to land the first wave on the beaches of southern England, and they established the bridgehead. But then the Royal Navy arrives, the Royal Air Force is still there, and they basically cut the supply lines. And to cut a relatively long story short, after about a week, the German troops in the south of England would have to surrender. That's the outcome of the 1974 war game in Camberley. Of course, as always, what ifs, we don't know, but I think it fits in quite nicely with everything that we've said and all the difficulties and problems that the Germans would have faced and the problems that they realized were there. And that, I think, is one of the main reasons why I say, we know what, we're not that keen on doing this. And so everyone is actually, I think, quite happy when Hitler then shelves the idea later in 1940, he just says, okay, maybe at a later stage. He returns to that in 1941. But then he also says, well, at a later stage, once the war in the East is gone. And then in 1944, you can see how they've lost it by that stage. That's where they basically say, it's probably not going to happen anymore, so let's stop planning for it. So you can see that's an interesting view of the world and reality in 1944. But there you are. And Hitler actually gives the order to start planning for the war in the East in late 1940, early 1941, when they're still thinking about the invasion of, at least on paper, the invasion of the UK. And of course, people in the Army High Command and the Air Force, they all know this. So they say, you know what, I think we can stop this here now. So it ain't going to happen. So we draw up some plans to keep people happy, but really let's not bother too much, and let's rather have another drink in the officer's mess. I think that's probably more important than looking at the invasion of the UK. And of course, the other thing that I hadn't really planned through and thought through, returning to a point I made earlier, this whole thing about what's going to happen to the UK afterwards. So after it's been occupied, where are you going to station troops? How are you going to run this? They had some basic ideas about districts that they wanted to establish. They have the so-called black box, which is a list of about, I think, 2,800 people that they want to arrest because they're very anti-German, very anti-Nazi. So these plans exist, but that's pretty much it. And it's really interesting when you talk to people in the UK even today. They always tell you that, well, Hitler wanted to have his headquarters in Blenheim. Blenheim is not far from Oxford, Blenheim Palace. It's probably the biggest palace in the UK. That's where Winston Churchill was born. That's why they didn't bomb it. Or in Oxford. That's why Oxford didn't get bombed. And the one that I always find the funniest is people from Scarborough in the northeast of England. If you're from Scarborough, forgive me, but there's not much there. But it wasn't bombed during the war, really, at that stage. There's a bit of stuff happening later on, and there's also stuff happening in the First World War. But they say, no, Hitler wanted to have his headquarters here. So why would Hitler want to go to Scarborough? So there's all sorts of interesting thoughts as well on the British side. But yeah, I don't think he would have gone to Scarborough. Terribly sorry for everyone from Scarborough, but there we are.
Take heart, British listeners. Our conclusion is that the Royal Navy would have more or less saved the day, and the German invasion probably would not have been successful. And it's interesting that we started today's episode with a reference to strategic board gaming, and we conclude more or less today's episode with a reference to military war gaming. So for the gamers out there, if you really want to go for the counterfactual, in Axis and Allies, go for Britain on turn 3 if you're Germany. You heard it here first. It's a risky thing, but it worked for me once, and I will never, ever forget it. In any case, there's lots more we could have talked about today. There's a great character on the German side called Vice Admiral Kurt Assmann. I'm not making that up. But if you want to learn more about him, we did a YouTube video on Sea Lion over at Real Time History. That's where I got the quote from earlier in this episode as well. You can check that out. And if memory serves, the Battle Guide YouTube channel has also dealt a little bit with the Battle of Britain and some other 1940 topics. So thanks so much, listeners, for being with us today on our little counterfactual sea lion journey. And we'll see you next time. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Linus, nothing funny happened. There were no huge outtakes. We didn't screw anything up, so sorry. No outtake for you, my friend.